Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday morning class about the coming of Mashiach. Today, our class is called A Vision for Mashiach, the Rebbe and the Rambam. So, if I was to ask you, if you envision the world during the times of Mashiach, how are you imagining, how are you visualizing the world? So, most probably, the answers that I'm going to get from many of you is you're imagining or visualizing a world that's filled with miracles. However, I hope you won't be too disappointed if I point out that in the Rambam teaches that actually there will not be any miracles which take place with the coming of Mashiach. And we're going to decipher and understand this law from the Rambam. So the Rambam is often the one that we go to when learning about Mashiach, because the Rambam wrote 2 chapters in his book that speak very much directly about the laws and defining what Mashiach is. There are many books written about Mashiach, but the Rambam kind of clearly cuts it out for us one thing at a time. The last two chapters of the entire book of the Rambam's famous work called Yad HaChazakah. So the Rambam says over there as follows: Al Ya'ale al Halev. You should not presume that in the era of Mashiach, any facet of the world's nature will change, or that there will be innovations in the work of creation. Rather, the world will continue according to its natural pattern. So the Rambam says, don't assume that there's going to be anything miraculous, anything different, anything changed. The world is going to continue in its regular pattern. What about, says the Rambam, the fact that it says in Isaiah, the wolf will dwell with the lamb? That's a miracle, right? Nowadays, if you put a wolf and a lamb in an enclosure together, what's going to happen? The wolf is going to devour the lamb. So the Rambam says, how can I, the Rambam, say that there will be no miracles when Mashiach will come? Nothing will change from the nature of the world. So he says all of these sayings that you find in the prophets, they are a mashal. A mashal means they are an analogy. These words, says the Rambam, and you can see on the screen, are metaphors and parables. All similar prophecies about Mashiach are metaphors. So for example, the Rambam says, what does it mean that the wolf will lie with the lamb? The wolf refers to the nations of the world that don't really love the Jewish people so much. And if it was up to them right now, they would devour us. And we, the Jewish people, are called the lamb. And when Mashiach comes, the wolf will lie with the lamb, that there's going to be peace amongst the nations of the world. No one is going to destroy us and try to harm us. So it's quite a statement from the Rambam, that the Rambam suggests that when Mashiach comes, there's not going to be any miracles. And even though if you look throughout the prophets, there's thousands or hundreds of prophecies that this is going to happen when Mashiach comes and that's going to happen when Mashiach comes, says the Rambam, this is all a mashal, an analogy, and just a parable. Some of them, for example, the wolf will lie with the lamb. The Rambam explains what the analogy is for. And in many of the other cases, the Rambam says, one day when Mashiach comes, we will then understand what it is that we're referring to. So when you think about this Rambam, the Rambam becomes extremely problematic. Why? Because just 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, not 2 weeks ago, but a few weeks ago, we spent 3 weeks talking about the Tchiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead. And when that class started, I showed you that the Rambam himself quotes the belief in the resurrection of the dead as one of the 13 principles of faith that a Jew has to believe in. So I'm not really sure about you, but to me, the dead coming back alive seems to be a massive miracle. You can't say that that's minhago shel olam, just the regular way of the world. So even if the Rambam wants to say that the wolf will lie with the lamb is an analogy, but he for sure believes in the concept of Tchiyas HaMeisim, of resurrection of the dead. So how can the Rambam possibly say, what does the Rambam mean when he says that when Mashiach comes, the world is not going to change at all from its nature, when he himself believes that there's going to be a concept of Tchiyat HaMeisim, of the resurrection of the dead. So what the Rebbe, who's the one giving this talk and explaining the Rambam, he says a very interesting thing. And this is really what we're going to talk about a lot. That according to the Rambam, there's actually going to be two phases in the coming of Mashiach. There's phase one, and then there's phase two. So there's going to be the initial phase after the arrival of Mashiach, where Mashiach arrives, he builds the Beit HaMikdash, he returns the dynasty of King David back to its original glory. All the Jews are once again able to perform Torah and mitzvot in its complete fashion. And at that stage, there's no miracles. Just regular day-to-day life. Don't expect any, flying miracles. And then after that's done, and I was debated a little bit exactly how long that's going to take, there begins a second era, second phase of the coming of Moshiach, which when we learned about this concept, I alluded to it because I told you then that it's going to be 40 years later after the arrival of Mashiach is going to be the resurrection of the dead. And then there's a second phase kicks in. And during the second phase, the second era, the second, time is going to be a world which is completely miraculous. The dead come back alive. And there's all sorts of different kinds of things that take place. And with this, the Rebbe is able to organize and kind of explain how, on one hand, the Rambam says that when Mashiach comes, there's not going to be any miracles. And on the other hand, when you think about Mashiach, we know Mashiach, the world is going to be filled with miracles. So what we want to talk about for a couple of minutes is what's the deeper meaning behind this? Why is it that way? And where is the Rebbe taking this from in the Rambam that there's going to be two clear stages? Because it's not something that the Rambam himself clearly says. And second of all, we know what introduces the first stage. There's this great charismatic king who is an expert in Torah knowledge. He leads all the people to repentance, etc. But what kind of ends the first stage and begins the second stage? We don't have anything clearly written from the Rambam. So with this, I'm going to show you a very interesting Talmud, piece from the Talmud, which really talks to a lot of what Mashiach is about. So it's right over here. It's on page, Carolyn, in your book, you'll see it on page 4 from that section that we're doing. So the Talmud says as follows. The Talmud says there's a verse in the book of Daniel, which says, Mashiach will arrive with heavenly clouds. It's a beautiful passage from the book of Daniel. One day, right, the heavens will be filled with beautiful clouds, and like a Disney fairy, Mashiach will be lying there, dressed up in his fanciest clothing, and he's going to float down from heaven, and it's going to be amazing and beautiful. However, says the Gemara, if you look in another place in the book of Zechariah, it says that Mashiach is going to come as a poor person riding on a donkey. It's just going to be a regular dude one day, shows up into town riding on a donkey, and that will be him. So from Daniel, the book of Daniel, you have this kind of romantic, beautiful picture painted of Mashiach that's coming on a cloud, representing obviously a lot of miracles. People don't ride clouds. On the other hand, you have the book of Zechariah saying that Mashiach is going to come in an ordinary fashion with the mode of transport that they used to use back in the day, right? Just driving a Prius or whatever it is, right? So the Gemara answers, the Talmud says, well, which one is it? Is Mashiach going to come in this miraculous, romantic fashion, in this fantastic way, or is it going to come in a regular way? So the Gemara says as follows, if the Jews are meritorious, he will come with heavenly clouds. If they are not meritorious, he will be a person riding on a donkey. Which we need to unpack this a little bit before we get back into the Rambam, because this is really a very important point in understanding the arrival of Mashiach. There's two formulas as to how Mashiach can come. In other words, Mashiach is for sure coming. One way is that Hashem, God, has put an end date to this misery that we're in right now. And no matter what we do, no matter how badly we screw up, he's coming by some date. All right? Please God, that let it be today. So even if we don't pull up our socks, as they like to tell us when I was younger, right? Nowadays they use different words for this, but if we don't shape up, Mashiach will still come. But if we are not meritorious, Mashiach comes as a result of just running out of time, so then Mashiach comes as a poor man riding on a donkey with no miraculous, fantastical features. It's just a boring, old, plain Mashiach. If, however, on the other hand, we, human beings, mankind, the Jewish people, through our actions, are able to merit the coming of Mashiach earlier than the set date, through our good actions, so then Mashiach's arrival is with a beautiful fanfare and a whole taradam and a whole wonderful, fantastical experience. So, just to give you another example, there's a contradiction in two different places as to who is going to build the third temple. In one place, it says that the third temple is going to be built by mankind. Moshiach himself is going to build the temple. He's going to go to Israel, make the plans, right? Hire the workers and start smashing away the way you would build a house. But in another place, it says that Moshiach is going to, that the Beit HaMikdash, the third temple, is going to come down from heaven as a built edifice. There's just going to be this miraculous building that's going to show up on Temple Mount. So the answer to which one is it, right? So the answer to the question is, it depends. If Mashiach comes early because we merit Mashiach's arrival, so then this beautiful Mashiach himself comes on clouds and the building descends from heaven. If, on the other hand, Mashiach comes as a result of running out of time, because the set date, but we didn't merit to bring him in earlier, so then we, the people led by Mashiach, have to build the actual temple. So it's kind of this two ways of Mashiach coming is really important to understanding many, many different sources as to the arrival of Mashiach and how it's going to be. So the Rebbe explains a very interesting thing. He says, the Rambam, Maimonides, that we quoted at the beginning of this class, that says, when Mashiach comes, there won't be any miracles. And even the wolf lying with the lamb is just an analogy, just a metaphor, because no miracles are going to take place. And then we said that there's going to be a second stage in the coming of Mashiach, and that's when all the miracles will take place. So the Rebbe explains, he says like this, in the Rambam is a book of halacha, a book of Jewish law. So the Rambam has to explain to us Mashiach on the bare basic level of how, what's the minimum requirement, so to say, for Mashiach to happen. What is the definition of Mashiach on a very legalistic, bare basic level? In other words, if you want to write poetry, you can write about whatever you want, right? If you want to write a letter to the Jewish people encouraging them to be hopeful for a wonderful time, you can write whatever you want. But if you're writing the bare basics of what Mashiach is on a minimal level, so the Rambam says on a minimal level, Mashiach is not a time of miracles. Is it possible that Mashiach will arrive early as a result of our good actions and be a miraculous time? Yes. But if you want to know what is the legalistic, the halachic definition of the coming of Mashiach, the halachic definition of the arrival of Mashiach is a king who will restore the Davidic dynasty back to its original glory, who will enable the Jewish people to fulfill the Torah and all of its 613 mitzvot in their entirety, and no miracles have to take place in order for Mashiach to come. In other words, we're not saying that there can't be miracles. We're just saying that in order for it to be Mashiach, it doesn't have to be miracles. However, that's only stage number one. Stage number one, which is the bare basic definition of what Mashiach is a time of no miracles. However, the Rebbe says you have to say that there's going to be a second stage after that, which is going to be the stage where miracles are going to take place. Why is that? Because imagine the following. Imagine the Jewish people are living in Israel. We have a king who is making sure that we are protected, are given all of our needs. He is a Torah teacher on par, if not greater than Moses himself. So no miracles, but everything is in place for the Jewish people to perform Torah and mitzvot in the best way possible. At that point, which is what Mashiach is at the very basic minimalistic level, at that point, the Jewish people are going to be studying the Torah and doing so many mitzvot. We are definitely going to be reaching the stage of meriting a miraculous Mashiach. Nowadays, things are tough. So maybe we're doing what we're supposed to, maybe we're not doing what we're supposed to. But when Mashiach comes and everything is really set up for us for perfect success, there's no doubt as to the fact that we are going to achieve that other achievement of having Mashiach because of our work. What do I mean by that? So before I presented to you these two options, either Mashiach comes on a cloud because we merited it, we worked for it, or Mashiach comes on a donkey because we didn't manage to get there. And it's either or. But really, the Rebbe explained it's not either or. It could happen in stages. If we don't manage to merit Mashiach, Mashiach will come on his own, riding on a donkey, and then we can still work towards the second stage of having the miraculous Mashiach. So the first Mashiach will just come, he'll restore the king, he'll be able to bring us to the stage where we can all do what we're supposed to. And then for sure, living in that environment, in that world, for sure we're going to reach the stage where we merit the greater, higher level of the miraculous Mashiach. So the Rebbe says you basically have to say that there's these two eras. There has to be, you're always for sure going to get to the second stage of Mashiach where we merited it. Either we'll get there straight away or we'll need Mashiach to help us get there. But there's no doubt that eventually we will get to this miraculous stage where the dead come back to life, etc., etc. So in the Rebbe's own words, on page 5, in the book that's in front of you, if you want to look that up with us. The bottom of the page says the Jews will have no oppressors or disturbances when Mashiach arrives. On the contrary, they will be free to engage fully with Torah and mitzvot. Therefore, it follows that they will attain the status of extraordinary merit, which would perforce, I don't even know what that word means, bring about the second stage. So in other words, when Mashiach comes, everything is going to be so good. Might not be miraculous, but things are going to be so good. There's for sure going to be, we're going to all be doing for sure what we're supposed to, and that will bring about the second era of Mashiach. So we introduced this concept that there's going to be two stages in the arrival of Mashiach, and what's leading us to say that there has to be a second stage, or what's going to be the instigator for the second stage of Mashiach. We introduce it by explaining that there's really two ways Mashiach can come. And even if Mashiach comes the unexciting way, like a poor man riding on a donkey because we didn't deserve it, there's still time to make up for that. Once Mashiach is here and we have, the new king, and we've built a temple and everyone is busy getting to know Hashem, etc., that will automatically lead into the second stage, because at that point, we'll all be doing for sure what we're supposed to. So that will bring about the second stage, the miraculous stage, the stage of miracles, the stage of resurrection of the dead, etc., etc. So now we're going to take a look at something very interesting that the Rambam brings. So when the Rambam is talking about this whole concept of Mashiach not doing miracles, you have to remember that the Rambam, again, is talking about the bare basics of what is the halachic, what is the Jewish, how does Jewish law define Mashiach? So the Rambam says, when talking about who the person of Mashiach is going to be, he says as follows, that Mashiach himself doesn't have to perform any miracles in order to be confirmed as Mashiach. So somebody says, hey, so-and-so is Moshiach. You'll say, well, if he's Mashiach, let me see him take a rabbit out of his hat, right? I want to see him split the sea. I don't know. Do something. If you're Mashiach, let me see a couple of tricks that you got. Says the Rambam, no. Mashiach himself doesn't have to perform any miracles. And he brings a very interesting proof from a man called Bar Kochba. Who was Bar Kochba? Also known as Bar Kuziba. Bar Kochba lived approximately in the year 127, or in the Hebrew calendar, say 3,887. About 60 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. So the Second Temple was destroyed by the Roman Empire. And at that point, some Jews were exiled from the land of Israel, some were not. But it was a tumultuous time. The temple had just been destroyed. There was still Jewish life taking place in Israel. But Israel was also under Roman rule at the time. So approximately 60 years after that, this man called Bar Kochba got up. He was a phenomenal warrior, young, charismatic, powerful, and initially had a tremendous amount of success in gathering an army and actually kicking out the Romans to some degree from the land of Israel. And he said, listen, this temple was destroyed, the Romans took over, but there's no reason why we can't fight back and take the land of Israel back and rebuild the temple and put up a king, etc. And he started out with this whole thing. Eventually, he was defeated by his army, and he was put down, and he was killed, through the Romans. So the Rambam said that during that time of Bar Kochba was the same time as the great Rabbi Akiva, right? The famous Messianic sage, Rabbi Akiva, who you've all heard of. And Rabbi Akiva said about Bar Kochba, this man, Bar Kochba, Shimon ben Kuziba, that he was Mashiach. And not only Rabbi Akiva, many of Rabbi Akiva's colleagues, fellow sages, said about Bar Kochba that he's Mashiach. And if you look at the story, Rabbi Akiva never asked Bar Kochba for a miracle. He didn't go to Bar Kochba and say, show me a miracle, and then I can say that you're Mashiach. Show you the text inside from the Rambam. So again, this is the Rambam bringing a proof that Mashiach doesn't have to perform any miracles in order to be confirmed as Mashiach. So he says as follows. Proof that the man Mashiach doesn't have to perform any miracles to be confirmed can be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, one of the great sages of the Mishnah, served as arms bearer for King Bar Kuziba and declared him Mashiach. So Rabbi Akiva went over to Bar Kochba and said, let me serve you, and you're Mashiach. He and all the sages of his time viewed him as the King Mashiach until he was killed for his sins. After he was killed, they realized that he was not the Mashiach, but they never at any point asked him to perform signs or wonders. So the Rambam said, this is the proof that in order to be confirmed Mashiach, you don't have to perform any miracles, which obviously goes very well with the other Rambam that we learned, that the initial stage of Mashiach's arrival doesn't have to be a miraculous time. The world can still be operating as regular. We just need Mashiach to be a charismatic king, to take the Jews back to Israel, to build a temple, to reinstall the great Sanhedrin, etc., etc. So in one place, the Rambam is talking about the king Mashiach, the person Mashiach. How do we know who Mashiach is? And miracles is not on that list. And elsewhere, the Rambam is talking about the era, the time of Mashiach. What's the world going to look like in the time of redemption? And also not having any miracles. And we brought in that whole thing that there's actually going to be two stages. So what's very interesting is that the Rambam is really only giving you half the picture. Not because he's trying to manipulate you, but he's really giving you only half the picture. Because if you look in other places in the Gemara, in the Talmud, talking about the story of Bar Kochba, which there's a lot written about him because he lived after the destruction of the Second Temple, a little bit before the times of the Mishnah. I mean, he wasn't not from 5,000 years ago. He was a character that was around in the times of Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochba and others, etc., in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, etc. So there's another Gemara that comes from Sanhedrin, which says that there was another group of sages, so not part of Rabbi Akiva and his friends, and they actually did ask Bar Kokhba to perform a miracle before they would be willing to acknowledge him as Mashiach. So one of the interesting things that it says about Mashiach is that Mashiach is Reach V'Don. He can smell and he can judge a person. Which perhaps a different time, why that attribute? What does that represent? But they went over to him and they said, okay, if you're Moshiach, as Rabbi Akiva thinks you are, you can see this on the screen in front of you on page 8. Bar Kuziba, that's Bar Kokhba, ruled for 2.5 years. He proclaimed to the sages, I am the Mashiach. And they replied, it is written that Mashiach can smell a person and judge his virtue based on the smell test. Let us see if you can smell and judge. When they saw that he was unable, they executed him. Little bit of a different story than the Rambam presented us. The Rambam presented us that Rabbi Akiva and his friends were carrying Bar Kokhba's arms. They were serving him. They declared him Mashiach until he was killed by his sin for his sins, at which point they acknowledged that he wasn't Mashiach. So, what's really going on over here? And what's interesting is that the idea that the Rambam presents that Mashiach doesn't have to perform any miracles is one opinion in the Gemara, but there's other opinions in the Gemara. There are other opinions in the Gemara that would say Mashiach absolutely does have to do. The Rambam chose to go with Rabbi Akiva as the halacha. He said the law follows Rabbi Akiva that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. The other interesting thing is that, did the sages ask him to perform miracles or not? We have from the Rambam that the sages did not. But we see from this Gemara that some sages actually did. And obviously it was a difference of opinion. Rabbi Akiva said, I'm not asking him to perform miracles because that's not the bare basic function of Mashiach. Someone can be Mashiach without performing miracles. But like in all areas of Jewish law, there's a machlokas, there's an argument. Some of the other sages at the time said to Rabbi Akiva, what are you talking about? In order to be Mashiach, for sure you have to do miracles. So if we want to consider Bar Kokhba to be Mashiach, he needs to perform a miracle for us. And lastly, this whole idea of who killed him, no one actually says that the sages themselves killed him, but according to many of the commentaries, the sages decided that he should be punished for his sins. He should be killed. And eventually it was the Romans that killed him. So, it's just an interesting, the Rambam is painting for us one picture. And by the way, there is a reason why we turn to the Rambam, because the Rambam is going into the Gemara and he's saying the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. So there's two opinions mentioned in this Gemara. One opinion saying that Mashiach has to do miracles. One opinion saying that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. But the Rambam is saying that we follow the law that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. So why do we, by the way, follow the Rambam? Because the Rambam is the only, and if not the only, the most famous halachic work that defines the halachic definition of Mashiach. The word halachic means law. He defines the halachic definition of Mashiach. There's obviously many works which talk about, Mashiach as a concept, etc. But in terms of what is the halachic definition of Mashiach, the Rambam is really the go-to with these last two chapters in his 14-volume work. So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with this quite a fascinating understanding of how it's going to work. There's the bare basic definition of the coming of Mashiach, written by the Rambam, which is that Mashiach himself doesn't have to perform any miracles to be considered Mashiach. And the era of the Messianic era doesn't have to be a miraculous era. And then the Rebbe introduced this concept that there's going to be two stages in the coming of Mashiach. There's this first stage, which is what the Rambam spoke about. And then there's a second stage, which is initiated through our actions, because Mashiach, he is the one to create a situation where we can perform Torah and mitzvot at our very best. And that introduces a second stage in the coming of Mashiach, which is this miraculous stage where the coming of there's Tchiyat HaMesim, the dead come back alive, etc., etc. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this concept of the Rambam's basic definition of Mashiach in the times of Mashiach, and our understanding that we're adding to that there's really two stages, two eras. There's the first one, which doesn't have to be miraculous, and then the second one, which is initiated by our work and our actions that we will do, that will then come in the second stage of Mashiach. Any questions or comments?
I would think that this would keep some people from losing hope when everything is so chaotic, when it seems like there's no way that we're all going to become good. When you look at the world as it is today, and then it seems like it would be impossible for Mashiach to overcome. So this interpretation gives hope that yes, it can still happen. It could still happen in our lifetime or whatever.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because we were saying spin on things.
Yes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because you're saying there's two ways for Mashiach to come, and one way is dependent on us, and one way is not dependent on us. There's a saying from the sages that says Mashiach will come in Hebrew behesach hadas. Hesach hadas means when we're not thinking about it. And the Rebbe one time said, "What does that mean? How can a Jew not be thinking about Mashiach?" Right? We know that it's one of the principles of faith. The Rambam clearly says that whoever doesn't believe or await Mashiach's coming is a heretic in the entire Torah. I mean, a Jew is never having hesach hadas, has never taken his mind off Mashiach. So the Rebbe explains something quite interesting. He says that even when we're in such a deep state of exile, and a person has hesach hadas, he's not thinking about Mashiach, meaning not that he's not thinking about it, of course he's thinking about Mashiach, but he thinks to himself, how can Mashiach possibly be coming now? Right? Everything is terrible. It's the darkest of the dark. It's the worst of the worst. So in that sense, he's having hesach hadas. He's removing his mind from Mashiach because he can't imagine how Mashiach could come at such a time. Still, we have faith that Mashiach can come because our faith transcends any logic. So, ein Mashiach bo ela behesach hadas means Mashiach won't come unless we're not thinking about it. Meaning, Mashiach comes even at a time when we're in such a deep exile that logically doesn't look like Mashiach can come, but our faith says that Mashiach can always come, and that in itself, that faith, that even at such a time where logically doesn't look like a time for Mashiach to come, that faith itself is the trigger for the arrival of Mashiach. The analogy has been given that we, as in the Jews of 2021, are like midgets on a giant's shoulders. Because why would Mashiach come now in our time? Are we any greater than the previous generations? The answer is no. Not only are we not greater, we're much less great. We're the opposite of great. We're lower than them. They were capable of much greater spirituality. Their accomplishments were much greater than ours were on a spiritual front. They contributed, much greater. In general, by the way, that's how we view history. It's a little bit weird or a little bit sad, but we view history that there's something that's going down, not up, from a spiritual perspective, right? The Mishnah is a greater level of holiness than the Gemara that came after that. The written Torah, which came first, is the holiest. As time goes on, there's no more prophets. Temple was destroyed, right? Less and less and less and less and less and less and less, etc. So why would Mashiach come now if he didn't come in the previous generations? What can we possibly do that they couldn't do? And the answer is Mashiach's not going to come now because we did something that they couldn't do. It's just that it's a cumulative effect. They, of course, are the giants, and we're just a midget on their shoulders. So if you have a big giant wall and the giant can't see, and he picks up a little kid and he puts a little kid on the shoulders, and you look over the wall, So the little kid is the one that sees over the wall, but not because the little kid is big enough to see over the wall. It's because it's a cumulative of the giants that came before him. So, to your point, sometimes when we find ourselves so deeply entrenched in exile, and it's like, how can Mashiach ever come today? If Mashiach didn't come in the times of Rabbi Akiva, in the times of the Gemara, in the times of the Rambam, in the times of the Baal Shem Tov, why would he come now? The answer can kind of be the opposite. On the contrary, that all of those efforts that they have been putting forth are not lost, and we are standing on their shoulders. And by the way, the fact that we don't see it is that's the definition of being in exile. On a technological front, on a scientific front, we in a way stand on the shoulders of those that came before us also. Today's science is because of Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein that paved the way for them. But we know what were the accomplishments of Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and why we stand on their shoulders. But in spiritual matters, we're not given the gift of seeing that. We don't see how the Rambam made the world a better place, and we're just, adding on top of that. We don't see how the Baal Shem Tov made the world a better place, and we're standing on top of that. All we see is the darkness, and we don't recognize all of that. That's because Hashem doesn't allow us to see it, hence being the fact in Golos, in exile. So we can't see the fact that we're the midget on the giant's shoulders, but the fact is that every effort that everyone puts in is accumulative. And it gets even better because the good that we do lasts forever, and the bad that a person does doesn't last forever. Any good that a person does lasts forever, because good inherently is real. Bad is just fake. It's just there because Hashem needed to create a challenge for us. So the good things that we do last forever. The negative things that we do don't last forever. So you have accumulatively thousands and thousands and thousands, 10,000, millions and millions and millions of good actions and mitzvot that everyone did, and we're adding to that. We're adding to that. So on one hand, yes, it seems like we're in the deepest, darkest exile, and how can Mashiach come now if things are so bad? So the answer is, that there's been the history that came before us. There's been all of these Jews that came before us. There's been so much been done before us. And specifically through holding on to the faith in such a dark time, that in itself triggers the coming of Mashiach. So in summary, and we'll stop here, we introduced into the Rambam this amazing idea that the Rebbe presents, that there's actually two eras, two times, that's a good word, two stages in the coming of Mashiach. And we connected it to what it says in the Gemara, that if we merit, Mashiach will come on clouds. And if we don't merit, Mashiach will come as a poor man riding on a donkey. And we explain it's not either one. It could happen in an order. Please God, today is the day that Hashem chose for Mashiach to come. So Mashiach might come in a normal, natural way, not perform any miracles. As the Rambam explains to us, what is the minimal, basic requirement of who Mashiach is and what he will do. And then, as a result of that, he's going to be this man, this person that's going to inspire us and take us to Israel. And we're going to do so much good things in that time that will trigger the second era, the second stage in the arrival of Mashiach. And then it's going to be a world filled with miracles, and the dead are going to come back alive, etc., with all of those wonderful things. I hope they gave some insight into how the operatings of Mashiach is going to work. I'm going to stop the recording so everyone can be comfortable to ask all the questions they want.